Yes, and welcome back at the Carbon Pricing Hub event. If you're just joining us now, my name is Talitha Muusse and I will be hosting this conversation. The Carbon Pricing Hub is a space for everybody who wants to participate and be involved with the ETS. Thank you so much for joining. And if you're already earlier with us, you saw the presentation and the first panel discussion, and we like to pick up on that and touch some of the topics, but also have some new insights. The first panel discussion was really about the policymaking process and the new proposal. And now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth, I think, on the impact for society from a stakeholder perspective, the impact, the opportunities, and the shortcomings of the ETS for also different sectors. I have two panelists joining me live here from Brussels, and I have two panelists who are digitally present. Maybe I can already see them in the screen to check if they're already there. Yes.
Hello, I'm there, Benjamin speaking.
And Julia, welcome also to you. Thank you for joining us today. Before we dive into the conversation, I would like to do another warm-up for our audience to see if they're still present and active. And I want to do that by asking two questions. You can fill in the poll. The first poll question is, and it also relates to the previous conversation we had, is in your view the climate ambition in the draft report enough to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement? Yes, certainly. Yes, I hope so. No, I'm a bit skeptical. No, definitely not. That's beyond skeptical. That was only the first. We see more people responding. Let's wait a little bit so we see some results and we can sense the optimism or pessimism in the room. Well, there are a few people, there's one person or a few people saying yes, certainty, but I think it's safe to say that a majority is more on the skeptical side or hopeful, hopeful to skeptical side, and even some people who are pretty sure already made up their minds this is not enough to meet the Fit for 55 goals. No, to meet the Paris Agreement, which I learned this morning, it's even beyond the 55 goals. Okay, so maybe to the next question. Let's move to the next question. Are the sectors currently covered by the EU ETS on track to meet adequate climate targets by 2030 and beyond? So this is about what the sectors separately are already doing and if they are on track to meet the targets by 2030 and beyond. Can I see the next poll? Because I see it. And then again, yes, certainly, yes, I hope so. No, I'm a bit skeptical. No, definitely not. Maybe if you can scroll down, because then we can, then we can see all the results. Perfect. I think, again, more on the skeptical side. Let's see maybe in this conversation how our panelists feel about this, and also if we can change your mind, if there's also room for optimism, and of course, to make it concrete, what can be done about this. So thank you very much. Now I would like to welcome our panelists. So here on my left side is Barbara Mariani. She's a policy manager for climate at European Environmental Bureau. Then on my screen is Julia Michalak. She's a senior advisor, EU Policy Brussels, the International Emissions Trading Association, the ETA. That's a lot. We're going to dive into that as well. And then on my right-hand side is Ben McWilliams. He's a research analyst for climate and energy policy at Bruegel. And then finally, also on the screen already, with a nice background, is Benjamin Denis. He's a senior policy advisor for the Green Deal and ETS at the IndustriAll Global Union, a trade union. So I'm really curious to hear from your perspectives, and let's dive right into the conversation. I think you also all prepared oh, that's my phone. Excuse me. An opening statement. And Barbara, I would like to start with you. What is would you say, maybe in short, your main position in this debate? The thing you like to bring to the table for this conversation the most from your point of view?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting the EB. And I followed the morning session, so many interesting things have already been said, but I would like to maybe reiterate some of them. First of all, we think the Commission's proposal is very conservative, and also Lisa's report is rather conservative with regard to the level of ambition that we need for industries to decarbonize in this decade. Why? Because the last decade, we considered it as a sort of lost decade for industry decarbonization due to too low CO2 prices and to a generous system of free allocations to industry. So the industry really needs to kind of catch up, and we need all economic sectors to contribute to try and limit the global average temperature rise by 1.5, which is the Paris Agreement goal, by half a century. And we, together with other NGOs, and Sabine also reminded it this morning, we believe that Europe can do more, can reach a 65% emission reductions only target by 2030. And therefore, that's why industry should do more to contribute to that target by reducing by 70% instead of 60% as proposed by the Commission. I also wanted to highlight a few fundamentals here. I've been working on the ETS directive for the past 12 years, so I know it pretty well. And all the technical details we've been discussing this morning, I mean, in a nutshell, what they are about, the technical thresholds, etc., are all rules and thresholds to kind of assess how many reductions, CO2 reductions in EU industrial sectors need to achieve within a certain time frame. And the ETS directive has also, it is a market-based mechanism, so CO2 allowances are bought on the basis of their market value. And as I said, this carbon price never went below 50 euros per ton in the last decade. So despite that, industry have profited from the free allocation system, meaning that which was supposed to address the risk of carbon leakage. I don't know, maybe it's worth reminding that carbon leakage means a risk of relocation of industries outside Europe, industrial activities outside Europe because of
environmental policies, carbon price,
impact. However, that price during the past 12 years have never really materialized to a risk, and there are studies demonstrating, and the carbon leakage risk never really took place. So what I want to say is that the free allocation mechanism must change, and we haven't seen any radical changes, not even something close to radical in the Commission's proposal or other in Lisa's report, which even kind of adds more the overall amount of free allocations to industry.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's just to get it clear. Do you, in the core, believe in a market mechanism for CO2 prices?
Well,
it's...
We believe in market mechanisms. They have to be combined with other measures, such as incentives, such as in the case of decarbonizing the energy sector and the energy-intensive industries. This also means putting in place the right regulatory instruments, adapting the grid, the infrastructure, incentivizing energy efficiency, etc.
But until how it has worked now, until now, the free allocations
it hasn't worked, and I can tell you why, because Sabine reminded this morning that industries have made wonderful profits of about 50 billion euros because of those free allowances given out in the previous ETS phase. And I just want to bring your attention to an important figure from CEP's study, which was mentioned this morning, by the way, that the free allowances that we're giving out for this period, for this phase of the ETS, amount to 40 billion euros per year. If you multiply 40 billion euros for 8 to 9 years, which is up to 2030, this makes up to 350 billion euros. It is a huge amount of money. And just to compare, this is half of the next generation EU recovery plan. So just to kind of keep in mind how much money we're giving out on the basis of many rules, with benchmarks, everything that we discussed this morning, that do not take into account the polluter pays principle, because the only way in which we could foresee a support to industry is upon proof that that support is entirely invested into reducing emissions by the time frame. Okay, so unless there is a strict conditionality, this is free money we're giving out. We cannot afford to give free money.
So you do believe in a market principle to reduce emissions, but it should be 100% a polluter's pay principle,
100%
and not the free allocation mechanisms should be out the door.
Absolutely.
What you're concerned.
And until a while ago, we said that the price, the right price, was going to be 100 euros per ton. This is no longer the case because the CO2 price is already 85 euros per ton. So the kind of floor price must be much higher than 100 euros per ton. And so I stop here because...
No, thank you. I think it's already a lot that you said that's interesting for the other panelists to touch upon. I have one more final question for you before I give the floor to our next speaker. I want to go to Julia next, so Julia knows she can prepare her statement. But I was intrigued that you called the last decade a lost decade for climate, basically. What happened in terms of what kind of worsening of the climate change situation have you seen that is of most concern to you? That you call it actually we're in a last decade.
Oh, I was referring to the last decade. I mean, between 2008 and 2021, if you want, 2020, because the fourth phase ended in 2020. So. What happened is that we had a financial crisis, so we had, which had an impact on also on the value of the CO2 on the market, and the CO2 price went down to zero. At a certain point, I remember it was probably 2015-16, the CO2 price went down to zero. Despite that, and this was clearly not a price to drive industry to switch to renewables and to energy efficiency solutions, because there was no driver in the ETS. And on top of that, they received the free allocations. So that's why we consider that a totally lost decade, and we need to catch up for that. Technologies are there, renewables are there, direct electrification, green hydrogen, they are there. For some of them, we need to invest more to make them more commercially viable, but options are there. There is a huge amount of money also in the recovery plans, as it has been said this morning, to drive industry towards innovation. There is an innovation fund, the modernization fund. So it's not a question about money, it's how you spend it. And it has been spent very, very badly so far.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I want to move to Julia. Can you please give us your first opening statement? You can also choose to respond already on what has been said, but maybe just to mention the main arguments you would like to raise for this conversation.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me just very briefly introduce IETA, who's International Emissions Trading Association. We are a business association with membership from a very wide range of sectors. So on the compliance side, for both power sector and industrials, but also others, leading companies from their verifiers, certifiers, exchanges, carbon analysts, over 170 companies that together with AITA agree to promote carbon markets as the most cost-efficient and environmentally sound solution to reduce carbon emissions. And we do believe that carbon pricing is the right tool. Of course, among other solutions, and there are also some command and control mechanisms needed, though we believe that this primary tool for European climate policy that drives decarbonization should be carbon market. So just to say that this is our starting point, and that's why we do support Commission's proposal to a large extent, and we do support when it comes to these core elements of ambition, Mr. Lise's report that does not propose changes to those elements like LRF increase or rebasing, or these elements that play with ambition to deliver the necessary carbon cuts. We think that these key elements are relevant to adjust the EU ETS not only with a minus 55 goal by 2030, but with a long-term target that we'll really look at with appreciation that the EU has managed to agree to adopt a net zero target by 2050, given how difficult conversations we used to have in the last 10 years within the EU about carbon market reform, starting with backloading and an MSR review, and then the review, MSR proposal, and then the review of the carbon market, but also debates about increased climate ambition. Those of you that were following these discussions, how to raise ambition, from 20 to 30% by 2020, remember the strong opposition out there among member states and very fierce debates in the parliament. And now in beginning of 2022, we have enshrined long-term carbon emission reduction target by 2050 net zero and 2030 as intermediate targets to get there. This is something that we appreciate and we support. And if the EU is serious about reaching net zero, then of course the EU ETS review is a crucial element to reach this. My apologies. To reach this target in a set cost effectively, but also of course there's a guaranteed environmental outcome, which is so important when it comes to carbon markets. There is a cap that guards that emissions don't go above that cap. We haven't yet discussed with the membership additional proposals made by Mr. Denis, as we were about to also speak about his report, but I can imagine that his proposals to brought forward introduction of the new ETS for road transport and building, and have a quicker introduction of maritime sector into the ETS, plus a new sector, so waste sector to also add to ETS might be looked by AITA members with interest, as this is again promoting this key instrument to deliver carbon cuts. On issue of Paris Agreement goals and 2050 as set, I think we have to look from a global perspective and from a broad perspective that it all must be looked together. So we cannot only have we can look on it one element, and we have to look as a combination of different goals on how to reach them in the right way. We don't comment on a price in principle, so I cannot comment on what's the right price, what's the wrong price. We don't have such conversations with AITA. We talk about a market that delivers, that is working well, that is characterized by sufficient liquidity, not too much volatile, with robust rules that underpin the functioning of the market, and we believe that the review of the ETS would ensure that. We're of course a bit concerned about what we're hearing these days coming from different European capitals, and also some market participants who are commenting on what's happening with regard to high energy prices, and how much does ETS contribute to that, and how much are those other factors that drive energy prices up. And we see market that is finally working. We see market that finally, after years of being not capable to really deliver scarcity and significant market price signal, is finally driving in the long term change of like technology change and fuel switch, and we just think it's quite an unfortunate coincidence that when the market started to work properly, we see a sharp increase in gas prices. And this is the main reason why we see the current energy crisis, but it's not market to blame. And we'd like to make clearly the point that we are against market intervention that would undermine confidence in the market. And we do not see ETS as being at all a key factor behind what's currently happening on energy markets. So maybe this is just a short introduction, and I'll be happy to talk more about specific parts of the Commission's proposal for the ETS review, but also CBAM and or carbon removals. There are, I think, many interesting things that we are watching closely.
Thank you very much, Julia. There was some background noise sometimes when you were talking, so I don't know if there was something in the room or something fell, but there was a lot of background noise at some point, so maybe you can check for the further remarks you're going to make in this conversation that we can hear you properly. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to Ben McWilliams, who's on my right hand side, research analyst, climate and energy policy at Bruegel. I already said that. Maybe you can also share a little bit of what your specific research field is and
Sure.
what it entails, and how you look at the conversation so far, what you would like to address.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. Well, Bruegel is an economic policy think tank, so we're already quite broad. And then for me, energy and climate is my specialization. Particularly, we worked on CBAM, on carbon contracts for difference. We're looking now into hydrogen and alternative fuels for the future. And these days we are consumed by the gas crisis, like everybody, I think.
Yep.
So this is roughly where we come from. Maybe for opening remarks, I also watched and enjoyed this morning, and the two key themes which I saw in the proposals from Peter Lees and also in the Commission's initial ETS proposal, which I like, are it's carbon pricing and this pushing of carbon pricing into new sectors, pushing the incidence of carbon pricing more strongly into existing sectors, and coming up with ways to extend this even beyond simple carbon price trade, such as through the concept of carbon contracts for difference and how we can push industries which were not currently encouraged at current carbon prices to abate, how we can translate carbon price signals and pass them on to them, which I'm happy to talk about more. And alongside this carbon pricing, it's distributional justice. For me, these are the two key words and the two key things to focus on. And while there are certainly areas that I would criticize and question in the proposals, these two principles for me are quite well reflected, and the Commission and the proposal does a good job of this.
And distributional justice, is that about how this affects people throughout all of Europe in terms of...
Yeah, I think there's multiple layers. There's indeed potentially the most important, how it affects people and households.
Exactly, yeah.
With this
incomes,
new ETS, and of course everybody knows what happened in France and whether this can happen elsewhere. In Australia, when they tried to introduce a carbon tax, also there was a bit of a political backlash and it wasn't introduced. People. Then you have also distributional justice across member states, which is why I'm very attracted and encouraged by the strengthening of the Innovation Fund. And for me, this is a big topic where more on industrial decarbonisation. I mean, the European market is threatened if we allow this to be pursued only by member states. So if we allow particular member states to push lots and lots of money into decarbonisation of heavy industry, which is great for achieving decarbonisation results, but it does threaten on a level the European market, and we're going to potentially arrive at a situation where certain member states decarbonise and they're happy with higher carbon prices and they're sitting in a nice place in 2035 and others are not. But on this, I think the Innovation Fund, the strengthening of it is really a great thing, and the money sitting there now is quite substantial.
How big is that difference within Europe when it comes to decarbonising their economies? Like, what are the most extremes maybe, and how far the economies are?
Depends on every sector. It's a bit different. But particularly in industry, when you look at the money, or take hydrogen as an example, when you look at the money and the innovation going into hydrogen, which today is not contributing to decarbonising our economy, but it's thought of as a potential fuel for the future, which can.
Yeah.
You see in Western Europe, in Germany, France, Spain, huge sums of money going into this, and in some Eastern countries, there's not the same enthusiasm and push for this, which is likely to result in differences in the future. On the power sector, the mixes differ massively by country, and this already reflects tensions at the moment with the energy crisis. Different countries, they all come with their own different opinions on how we should price power because they have different fuel mixes.
And do you mean with justice also that these differences have grown through history, development, geographical differences, differences that are not necessarily, the cause is not necessarily their current, might not be their current political stance or ambition or efforts. It could be something that has grown unequal before, and that it might.
Yeah, it's always hard when you take a starting position of a country and when you think they should have started to decarbonize. I mean, was it 2005 when this is when you should really have been ready to decarbonize, and some countries were starting at different positions?
Yeah, it's the same discussion you have globally, right?
Between, but the risk is that we always start discussing it from today. I mean, now in certain member states or countries who have huge coal mixes, it's difficult to always give, always to give more things and more compensation for this because of where you start today. At some point, you need to take into account the last certain number of years, and there was a responsibility to decarbonize during this time.
Yeah, great. Something more you like to add? That you say that this is specific. I was also interested in how you looked at the model that was presented earlier today by Peter Williams.
Sure.
Did you agree with his analysis or his concern actually that we might not be able to reduce all the emissions we want because of this gap?
So I think I find it fascinating, and I saw they made it transparent and available online, so I'm definitely wanting to check this out. But I mean, whether the model is correct, you saw the Commission's model comes up with different numbers, or I think he tried to explain it. But we're also working in a consortium of modelers, Paris Reinforced across Europe, and it's really fascinating how, I mean, these models, they output based on assumptions and interactions in the model, and they come up with different things, which is really interesting, and we should study this and learn from this. But I find it difficult to say what one model says is what's going to happen and what another says is what's going to happen.
I think a key thing that he mentioned was transparency. I think it's something you agree with, that we need to have a lot of transparency on these models and the monitoring of...
I didn't properly look into it, but the effort to make it transparently available is really great, and I look forward to looking into it.
Great. Yes, and then we're going to move to Benjamin, our panelist, back on the screen again. Benjamin, where are you?
I'm in Brussels.
You're also in Brussels, around the corner.
Yes. I couldn't come to the studio just because of another commitment this morning, which ended at 1 p.m. So it was really too short for me to cross Brussels, and sorry for that. But I'm using the fallback option, which is the online connection. Yeah.
Maybe you can also shortly explain the IndustriAll Global Union, who you represent, and maybe a little bit on your background and what you would like to mention as the main concerns for you in this conversation.
Yeah. So good afternoon to all of you, friends and colleagues. First, I'm representing IndustriAll Europe, not global. So Global is our sister organization, but we are only covering European countries. And so we are the European Trade Union Federation representing workers from industry, extractive industry, energy industry, and most of the manufacturing industries like steel and basic metal, chemicals, and so on and so forth. Also automotive, aviation, shipbuilding. So altogether, roughly 7 million of men and women working in European industries.
Yes.
This is who we are.
That's
and
great.
So I can continue if you want. I can, as you know, I can
Maybe
talk.
You can continue on what would be for you the main comment you would like to make.
Yeah, so the key words we usually use in those debates, as many of you know, is just transition. This is really a trade union concept. The idea is that we, of course, support the fight against climate change. More precisely, we support the carbon neutrality objective and the revision of the 2030 emission reduction target. But we also know as trade unions that there are different pathways to reach emission reduction targets, and the one we prefer is the just transition pathway. It means at least three things. First, we need to base our climate policies on sustainable industrial policy that will aim at transforming the industry through investment, innovation, new rules, new products, new technologies, to keep those value chains and, of course, the related jobs. This is the first key condition of a just transition. And transition doesn't mean disruption. Two, we also want the workers and the communities that might be negatively impacted by the decarbonization agenda to get specific support from public authorities. Financial resources must be there to accompany those people along the way of the transition. And last but not least, we also insist on the fact that the climate policy instruments that are implemented cannot lead to distributional impact that will be detrimental to the low-income households. So we see a lot of regressive instruments being discussed, and carbon pricing, carbon markets are regressive instruments, at least at the beginning. We have to see what are the measures, what are the decisions and the mechanisms that are created to cushion, compensate, mitigate those regressive impacts. And we also have to see how these instruments are interacting with other aspects. I mean, carbon pricing policies are not implemented in a social vacuum. Taxation policy matters, labor law matters. So the more precariousness you have on the labor market, the lowest the wages and the incomes, the more difficult it will be for the population to accept carbon pricing instruments. This is in a nutshell the kind of key requirements we have regarding the discussion on EU climate policies. And of course, we also insist that process matters, governance matters. And when it comes to measures that impact the world of work, our key sentence is nothing about us without us. Social dialogue, industrial relation is really key to negotiate plans that will allow workers and communities to anticipate the changes ahead of us. So these are the key principles within which we see the ETS discussion. Now, if you want, I can continue more specifically on the ETS.
Great. Now, I would like to first maybe ask you a question. You said just transition is not a disruption, and you're concerned for the social implications of carbon tax policies. Do you, under the current ETS, already see social implications that you would label as unjust right now?
You know, in all the meetings we have with our members, energy prices is mentioned as the top priority. Now, we have to be crystal clear. The current energy price crisis is not driven by the climate policy. It's mainly driven by a commodity issue. And when it comes to gas, the EU imports roughly 90% of its gas. We have very little and indirect influence on producers. We have very little influence on the global demand side. So we are, as European Union, when it comes to gas, we are price taker and we are exposed to volatility. Of course, we can implement joint purchase agreements, increase the storage, and so on and so forth to try to mitigate that commodity price volatility issue. but the basic rule is that we are price taker. Now, on top of that, it doesn't mean that the carbon price and the EU ETS is not playing any role in the electricity price for two reasons. First, we have to keep in mind that, as Ben rightly said, there are strong differences across member states in terms of energy mix and in terms of economic pattern. And it's obvious that in member states with much more, I would say, carbonized electricity mix, the direct impact of the ETS is more important than in other regions. Now, in the final price paid by final consumers, I don't have the figures in front of me, but the share due to the ETS might be rather limited. There is another aspect to be considered, it's the link between the electricity wholesale market and the EU ETS. As you might know, the EU electricity market rules are based on a price setting mechanism using marginal price method, meaning that often the more expensive electricity source is the price setter. So if you need 10% of gas to cover your electricity needs, the gas-based electricity will set the price for the whole electricity. And it's a way which imports the energy price increase into the electricity market, and it imports mainly the commodity aspect, but also the carbon price aspect. And we might just question whether it makes sense to keep such a price setting mechanism in an electricity mix that will become hopefully more and more decarbonized in the years to come. So these are two aspects of the distributional issue discussion that might be interesting to consider.
Definitely, thank you very much. Maybe it would be nice to have both Julia and Benjamin now on the screen at the same time, so we can also see your reactions while we're also continuing the conversation. Yeah, maybe a little bit bigger, that would be great. Yeah, maybe Ben, on the price setting mechanism, is that a problem? That the most expensive energy decides the pricing?
Difficult
Especially
question.
if in the future renewable energy will become a bigger part of the mix. How do you see that?
Yeah, and it's one of the debates now. It's quite big in Europe these days. I mean, part of the rationale is that you want to have your price as an allocating mechanism at the marginal cost. And in other markets, it makes sense. Whether it makes sense in power markets and in power markets that were designed many years ago with no renewables in there, yeah, is a tough question. I think that most likely the growth of renewables and penetration into markets will need us to reform. We're also going to need more in the same area, more dynamic pricing, likely more local and geographically dispersed pricing. Renewables are popping up in different parts of countries, but in general, in countries or in bidding zones, in one country you still have one price across. Where in reality, this isn't really the underlying market. And at some point, if you want to bring these correct prices through that will encourage the next round of renewables that we need in the future, you are going to need to rethink market design. But yeah, it's a very complicated question with multiple nuances.
Yeah, something I find difficult to grasp so far, and this is also in the first conversation, is that Benjamin was saying right now the ETS is not the main driver for the rising energy prices. But how much will it be the driver of rising prices in the future? Is it fair that it's that it's being mentioned as one of the big concerns right now?
In electricity, I think you mean.
In electricity.
I mean, as we decarbonize electricity and as we have less and less carbon in the mix, it should really fade out. I mean, by 2035, we should have zero emissions.
Compensated by the
it should gradually phase out. So I don't think in power is the big challenge. I think, as Julia says, it's nice for governments, and I've seen the same publications by governments who are now blaming all of this price rise on the ETS, which is, I mean, simply incorrect. There's statistics out which show the share of gas. I don't think ETS on power prices is the huge long-term, mid to long-term threat.
Yeah. Maybe just to touch upon a question that has already been sent in, because then the chat will ask new questions. Should ETS policymaking keep step with technological progress? Yeah, I would right away say of course, but the proposal to delay free allotment as there is confidence to decarbonize using green, blue, hydrogen. What do you think is the best way to bridge gaps between emission goals and technological progress? Benjamin, could you reflect on that? Ben,
Sure.
sorry, Ben.
Sure.
Benjamin will go.
Sure. Yeah, I think on technological progress and bridging gaps to emissions goals, it is one topic which we have worked on, particularly in the area of what are called carbon contracts for difference, is the mouthful name, and which we try to brand as commercialization contracts. And by this, the goal of this is bringing new green technologies to the market in Europe, which today they exist and they work, and in principle they've been shown to work, but they cannot compete with existing industrial installations. Now, why is it so important? Well, I think to have additional measures above and beyond the carbon price, because some people will say, well, look, there's an ETS price, there's a carbon price, the allowances are going to go to zero at some point. If you're an industrial installation, you should be making these investments. Yeah. But if we look at the history of the ETS, and when we had power in the early days, it was not the ETS which drove this huge investment into renewables. It was Germany and other countries with huge subsidies who brought this alive. And that was huge. I mean, now that means that solar and wind can be incentivized by a carbon price, and effectively you brought down the commercial costs of them, and now they're in this band where they are influenced by a carbon price, not only in Europe, in the whole world, which was a huge effort. And I think now the time is that we need to do the same thing for industry, particularly heavy industry, and where we need these technologies to be deployed in Europe and globally.
What you're saying basically is that ETS won't be sufficient enough for especially very new technologies
it's difficult for multiple reasons. One, okay, today the price is at €80 a ton or whatever, but for many years, as we discussed, it's been very low. And if you're a company, it's very difficult to justify these investments when the price is low. And also, it's not certain. I mean, it's a social construct, the ETS. I believe in it, and I hope it stays there. But you can play with it. You can do things that adjust the price. So, as a company, I can see it is difficult when you need prices of €150 per ton to justify your investment. So briefly, our proposal is to provide subsidies to companies for deploying green installations. Where
is that from the funds?
For example, for the Innovation Fund, you could use the Innovation Fund to do this, where your subsidy is tied to a strike price, a carbon strike price, and you receive the difference between whatever the price on average was that year and this price.
The price of the new technology.
And across Europe, in an ideal world, I'm an economist, so I'm always looking for this ideal perfect world.
What would be the optimal distribution?
Well, ideally, we would believe in competition and bidding across Europe with, as always, certain steps taken that it doesn't all end up in one place or all in one industry, but as much as possible, transparent bidding based on a carbon price needed to realize your project, and then that's how we allocate European funding around Europe.
Would you like to?
Yes, I would like to chip in because.
And if you want to raise a comment, Julia and Benjamin, please, you can raise the hand also as an option. The real hand or the little hand in the in your screen. Yes, Barbara.
Yes, I would like to chip in because Benjamin mentioned the importance of, kind of reminded us that we are hugely dependent on gas imports. And I wanted to clarify for those who are not experts that the ETS cannot work alone. Why? Because most of the emissions of the ETS under the directive comes from energy use. A good amount come from process emissions, but most of the emissions come from energy use. So until you decarbonize the energy grid, of course, industry will have to get their energy from the existing energy sources. And if we use gas, and if we use still coal in some countries, but gas is now really in the spotlight. Until they use gas to power their industries, it will be difficult to decarbonize, almost impossible. You cannot decarbonize through using fossil gas. So that's why the ETS must be seen in combination with other instruments, such as the Renewable Energy Directive, because until we have a wide uptake of renewables in Europe, we won't be able to decarbonize our economies. And there is another point that Benjamin made, and the fact that the most carbon-intensive countries in Europe are those where the social impacts will be the highest. It's true. And why? Because those economies happen to be extremely dependent on carbon-intensive sources, either indigenous, such as coal in Poland or in other regions, or imported. So it's a lose-lose sort of game if we do not take into account that we need to massively change our energy system and decarbonize as quickly as possible to allow industry to also decarbonize. This is a discussion that people who do deal with ETS and people who deal with the RED directive do not always have. And I think there is also another important element, which is energy efficiency. If there is one element where the ETS directive is really, really very weak, is energy efficiency obligations. Because the directive does not mandate any energy efficiency obligations and leaves this to other instruments, such as, for instance, the Energy Efficiency Directive, which, however, is not at all fit for purpose when decarbonizing industry. And the loophole in the ETS directive is that there is no link between the ETS and another important regulatory instrument, which is the Industrial Emissions Directive, which regulates emissions of all kind of sources, and which does not set a threshold for greenhouse gas emissions. And so there is a link when it comes to mandating energy efficiency improvements in industry. And this is key, because one of the most difficult things for industry, I've worked in industry for a long time, is being able to produce the same amount of products by using less industry. It's really a challenging target for industry, but we're not addressing this, and we need to address this as soon as possible.
Yeah. How would you say, how far is that energy-intensive industry when it comes to decarbonizing?
Not, I think we are nowhere near. There are front runners who already can be considered carbon neutral, especially in the steel sector, but we're nowhere near in terms of decarbonizing their energy supply, their process emissions, circular economy, etc. So there is a huge amount.
And you don't see under this new proposal, you don't see that changing rapidly enough?
I don't see that change because of those technical thresholds which have been discussed this morning, and it all boils down to the fact that the ambition is not enough, and that if we still give free allowances to industry,
do we need disruption instead of transition? Because
yes,
Benjamin said...
We always said we need a radical change, and we need to think out of the box. I was glad to see Jos Delbecque this morning, because he is one of the designers of the ETS directive. And to me, it's incredible that after so many years, nobody is really able to think out of the box and to rethink this instrument. Is it fit for purpose today? Yes, no, why? No one wants to challenge the status quo. And this is probably the message I would like to finish my kind of
you are challenging. No, it's great. Julia,
sorry for taking too long.
Do you agree with this analysis that the energy-intensive industry is nowhere near decarbonizing, and that's not going fast enough? Oh, sorry.
Well, I'm happy to... Can you hear me now well?
Yes, we can hear you.
happy to respond to that question, but if you permit, I would like to first comment on the issue of social consequences and social problems we are having with regard to, as a consequence, rather, as of high energy prices, but also what we're discussing in the context of the ETS review related to a higher price of US and rising power prices. And I would like to raise three, I think, really important points. And the first one are revenues that are generated by the ETS. And obviously, higher price it is, more revenues we have. Revenues go to national governments, to their coffers. And although most member states report that they spend all revenues from ETS trading on a climate energy purpose, decarbonization, increasing energy efficiency, and so on, I would still have doubts whether this is really the case. In some member states, the accounting is not really very clear. And I think there is a great room for improvement here to ensure with the ETS review that this money is really being spent on purpose. And we talk about quite some substantial sums. So for instance, in 2020, total revenues were about 19 billion euro for all EU member states. In 2021, from the first half, is almost 14 billion euro. And these are sums that only will be growing if the current prices remain at the level we see these days, or if they increase. Second, I find important and not maybe discussed enough the mechanism of free allocation to power producers in Central and Eastern Europe. There are 10 member states that if in the ETS phase 3, and now it is phase 4, were given opportunity to grant free allocation to power sector. Right now, there are only 3 that decided to make use of that option. It's Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. Other member states decided to move these allowances into a modernization fund. Then later on, they will be available for these member states. It's their share. But 3 member states still decided to give free allocation to the power producers. And this is exactly to help those member states to elevate an impact of the rising ETS prices on the power prices. And this allocation must be compensated by investments in decarbonization. So there is also this conditionality there. So this is a second mechanism that has been put in place. It's quite controversial, but it has been put in place and has been utilized in the recent years by numerous member states, now as said only by 3, to help to make this transition more soft for those member states that are highly coal dependent, some of them, and in principle, these are lower income member states. These are 10 mainly Eastern European member states. And then the third important point is modernization fund. Again, an instrument which is out there and working and delivering, and will be delivering even more. As I also watched, of course, the first part of the conversation today. I found very interesting the debate that you had, and findings from the report were also some of them were quite surprising. But what was said is, of course, that the Innovation Fund and Modernization Fund will increase significantly with new ETS rules. And the Innovation Fund, it was said, will almost double. Modernization Fund, I did not note exactly what will be the increase, but it was quite substantial. So this is also a mechanism which is there to help those lower income member states to decarbonize, to support their path towards low carbon economy. And these are member states, of course, where the social consequences can hit vulnerable households most. So just to say that if we talk about the ETS being even partially responsible, or perhaps in the future contributing to a power price increase, there are numerous mechanisms and there are numerous ways on how it can be elevated via ETS, because this is the same mechanism that provides, of course, revenues, but also the charges polluters for polluting. So just to say, I think this is important to raise in a bit more kind of precise manner what we're talking about when we talk about ETS and consequences and mechanism that can help these lower income member states in decarbonizing, which of course will also lead to lower power prices, as said by Ben. Of course, if we have less coal, less carbon intensive fuels, then the system is delivering cheaper energy. About now, I would like to revert to your question about energy-intensive industries. Well, we also have a yep.
Yeah, can I shortly interrupt? I would like to maybe first have Barbara react on one of the three things you just mentioned, and then we'll pick up on the on the industry, because I was really curious, because what I hear from Julia is actually a positive effect of the free allocation when it comes to power producers. She's saying this can also help member states with lower incomes to compensate for rising energy prices, as also a positive effect of the free allocation mechanism. Do you see that?
Can I?
No.
I think
the free allocations go to industry operators. And actually they do whatever they want with them. You know, they can either decide to keep them and sell them and then get money out of it, or they can decide to use them to reduce their emissions and invest into technologies. There is no mandatory requirement in the directive that they should spend. I think what Julia was mentioning is the revenues from the sale of ETS permits. Those revenues go into national budgets as well as into the Innovation and Modernization Fund. And once they are they go into the national budgets, well, so far only 50% of those revenues had to be spent for climate purposes. 50% was a bit vague in terms of kind of destination. The revision of the directive has established that 100% will have to be will have to be spent for climate-only purposes, which is a very positive step forward. However, by looking at how the member states have used the revenues from the auctioning of CO2 permits, some all of them have behaved
actually spend
very
it
well. There are many differences, and it's good to know that in some states they have been reinvested into addressing the social dimension, etc. But there are other instruments. There is the Just Transition Fund, the Just Transition Mechanism. So at the end of the day, you know, we need to really be very careful on how this money is spent, without mentioning the recovery plan. So it's a huge amount of money when you top up the different instruments, and there is really a problem of lack of transparency, for instance. You know, how the money is spent.
Can I jump in?
Yes, Benjamin,
I would like
and then I'll come back to Julia. Yeah.
And that's it.
Sorry, Benjamin, you can.
No, there are many things that I would like to say. First, on the electricity price, we are fully aware of the flexible mechanisms existing under the ETS directive, keeping in mind that since the beginning of phase 4, early January, indeed 7 member states in 10 do not use anymore that possibility to keep free allowances. But we have to keep, for power production, I mean, but we have to keep in mind that the money made available do not necessarily go to support measures for those that are impacted by the price increase that might be to some extent influenced by ETS and carbon price developments. It is in the hands of national governments to decide how to design exactly those policies. Now, we of course support the Modernization Fund. We support the proposals to increase the resources available through the Modernization Fund, including the one mentioned in Mr. Liese's draft report, to better support the most vulnerable regions. And when it comes to the Just Transition Fund, we have to keep in mind that initially, about 2 years ago, the Commission made an assessment and proposed to set up a Just Transition Fund made of 40 billion euros for the next MFF period. And that fund was designed to mainly address the problems in coal-dependent regions. Then it has been decided to expand the scope to other fossil fuel dependent industrial activities, so scope extended. And instead of having 40 billion euros available, we ended up with 17.5 billion euros in the Just Transition Fund. You might add to that all the other resources that might be available through the Just Transition mechanism and the Innovate Europe and so on and so forth. But these are more forecasts than commitments. So we have 17.5 billion euros to support regions that might be impacted by the decarbonization process. And we believe this is far from what is necessary to cope with all the challenges: labor transformation, industrial diversification, change in the energy systems, and so on and so forth. And when it comes to the additional auctioning revenues, we of course support the idea to earmark a significant share of those additional revenues to better support regions and workers depending on fossil fuel activities and facing structural change. But we have also to keep in mind that it has to be seen in a wider debate about the future EU budget and possible new own resources, because it has been mentioned that part of those auctioning revenues might be used to as additional own resources for the EU budget. And there is also a discussion about the Growth and Stability Pact and whether we go back or not to the budgetary discipline rules. And I'm afraid that if the austerity rules are back as they were before the pandemic, those additional auctioning revenues might quickly vanish in budgetary discussions at member states or at EU level. So that's what I wanted to say. Ik heb ook een vraag van Jeroen Fontijn gekregen op de chat. Can I answer to that question?
Of course, yeah. And it very tactically, you're moving to Dutch, which...
No, the question was the following: why do you insist on keeping existing industrial value chains, and why don't you mention much the new industrial value chains? And I mean, this is a very good question. But I would like to remind that there are two reasons for which we mention the existing industrial value chains. The first might be relatively specific to trade unions. It's simply because whether we like it or not, we have almost 8 million workers in those industries nowadays in Europe, in the energy intensive industries. I mean, those that are mainly covered by the ETS. And so it's a quite significant number of men and women. And we care about their future, we care about their fate, and we believe that would deserve an answer. And we believe that this answer is not in disruption, but again in transition. And the second reason why we care about that, it's because we believe it's a mistake to oppose new value chains to existing value chains. If you look at the renewable energy value chains, the ones that you mentioned in your question, Jeroen, actually it's quite metal intensive. To build windmills, you need steel, you need aluminium, you need a series of basic metals. The same to expand the rail network and the public transport network. If you look at the renovation of buildings to make them zero emission, you need steel, you need glass, you need insulation materials which come from the chemical industry. So it would be a dramatic mistake for the EU to oppose the new industrial value chains to the existing one. We need innovation, we need investment, we need to retrain people, we need plans to transform those industries, and we need to protect them against carbon leakage. I would agree with what has been said earlier today, that it would be ridiculous to ascribe to the EU ETS a significant role in carbon leakage and disindustrialization when the carbon price was below 15 euros a ton, keeping in mind that we also have state aid for indirect costs and free allocation. But it would be also ridiculous to pretend that this non-existence of carbon leakage should be taken for granted. If we make an ex-ante assessment, I mean, it's clear that a carbon price around 100 euros a ton opens a new discussion on carbon leakage. We also have to keep in mind, especially if it goes hand in hand with other policy changes, such as a phase down of free allocation. And we also have to keep in mind that it's not taking place in a vacuum. It's also additional to other aspects on which the EU industry has a competitive disadvantage compared to other parts of the world. We can here again mention electricity cost. We can mention some issues when it comes to commodity. We could also mention surplus on global markets. And all those aspects must be taken together to understand the impact of ETS on industries and on its competitiveness. Again, what is at stake is the fate of almost 8 million workers, men and women working in Europe. So we care a lot about that as trade unions.
Yeah. Something I always wonder in this discussion also about carbon leakage is, there's this earlier this morning was also mentioned, we don't want to deindustrialize Europe. We would be crazy to do it. On the other hand, it's on something that union federations themselves have said. Maybe it's even your quote, Benjamin. There are no jobs on a dead planet. So if we, what would be the worst an outcome? Why is it such a bad thing to more rapidly, maybe with the consequence of deindustrializing, but saving the planet? I'm always curious, like, what is the rationale behind it? When you say there are no jobs on a dead planet, you seem to agree. Planet over jobs.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the key requirement for our shared prosperity is a good environment, and it's absolutely true that there is no job to defend, there is no social justice to defend in a world that would be 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial world. That's absolutely obvious. Now, the key question we have to ask ourselves is, what are the key conditions, the key enabling elements we need to reach the emission reduction objectives that are compatible with the Paris Agreement? And we strongly believe that among the key enabling elements we need, there is the need to keep the industrial basis in Europe and in other regions in the world. The situation is the same, to ensure that people will have a job and will have an income, because whether we like it or not, a significant number of our citizens, and I think that it's a majority of them, needs a job to have an income. If you destroy the jobs, you make the income much lower. It's absolutely obvious. And if we end up in such a situation, you will have a lot of people resistance against climate policy. So we believe that people do not have to make a choice between what we call in French fin du monde et fin du mois. The idea is not to make a choice between earning his life, having a decent employment, decent job and a good wage, and so on and so forth, and saving the planet. Yeah. We have the means, we have the resources to combine the two objectives, and we believe that these are the two sides of the same coin. If we destroy jobs, if we deepen inequalities, if we create precariousness and social insecurity among society, I'm afraid we will not have the social cohesion which is needed to secure the achievement of the climate targets.
Clear.
That would be my quick answer.
Yeah, I want to take a look at the chat to see if there are also other questions coming in for other panelists. One for Ben. People in the chat are looking for resources to study on CFD. What are you talking about?
I think carbon contracts for difference, which I mentioned. Well, we have a paper in Bruegel, which you can see if you like our work, but also for the references section at the end. We reference all of the recent studies on this, which I think is a nice source to begin from. As I said, commercialization contracts is the name that we give. So if you search on Google Bruegel and commercialization contracts, you find our paper and you can read it if you like, and at least look at the references section, and then you get all the recent work there.
Yeah, maybe something else that you've studied in depth is a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I tried yesterday evening to get more information on that and to understand it properly. What do you? Is that a new mechanism that's introduced for this proposal?
Sure. So also as Benjamin discusses, so I mean the basic concept is, well, should be trying to remove the free allowances which we currently have under the ETS. So for electricity generation, when you put a carbon price on it, it's fine because you cannot move it, you cannot import your electricity from Africa. But when we're talking about steel plants, aluminium plants, there's an argument that if you put the carbon price on them, potentially they're now exposed to unfair competition from abroad, and hence maybe relocate. And this is the free allocation has always been to solve this. And now, indeed, in the last set of proposals, the Commission has proposed a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which theoretically should allow you to remove free allocation, because now you force that people who import products into Europe pay a carbon price probably equivalent to the price in the ETS for what they import into Europe. It's insanely complicated. I'm skeptical that it works. There's a range of challenges you have to, I mean, first, logistically and administratively. I mean, in Europe, it took many years to understand these value chains and account emissions in Europe and come up with our system. When you want to go to other countries and do this, it's going to be really, really hard. It sounds like a very big
administration you would need to set up.
There's so many things. I mean, electricity, for example, how you account electricity production and the emissions for this is difficult. One area, politically, it's going to be a real challenge. I mean, America and China are pretty obviously and pretty vocal in their opposition, and they push back hard against this. And I mean, others will say this is just protectionism, this is trade protectionism, and they're going to push back. And then also you have just trade as a complex being. I mean, it moves all around the world, and when you try and, I mean, you see in general tariffs don't really work. They don't work well. One example. In America, Trump, he also tried a similar thing a few years ago. He wanted to put tariffs on steel and aluminium. So he put it on the basic steel and aluminium products. What happened? America stopped importing as much steel and aluminium basic products, which is what he wanted. But what happened is they started to import nails, steel nails, and they started to import aluminium beer kegs, which is the challenge. And the Commission, of course, understands this, and you can see in their proposal they're very detailed, and they try and go, but you have to go really far down these value chains, and it's very difficult to stop this sort of deviation and trade, flowing around barriers and finding ways around. So
before you know, they remove the problem to another area. And
it's always going to shift around, and you risk creating this bureaucratic monster which is constantly chasing trade around the world, and it's really, really challenging.
Julia.
I'm raising my virtual and real hand at the same time. I would like to comment on that, as I think there is one very important and interesting element of the CBAM proposal that hasn't been yet mentioned, which is its international dimension. CBAM can become a very powerful diplomatic tool, as we already see that from the moment when the Commission tabled its proposal for CBAM, which we as IETA support, we are in favor of gradual phase out of free allocation and introduction of the CBAM. From that very moment, a conversation with main EU trade partners has really started about introduction of a carbon pricing mechanism and rules that the EU has proposed to establish not to apply the CBAM fee to member states with similar carbon pricing policies in place, because that's, of course, what those countries are most interested in. And we already see that in countries like Turkey, Ukraine, Georgia, there are quite advanced political discussions about the CBAM proposal, and that it really encourages many countries to discuss or consider eventually to introduce, hopefully, comparable carbon pricing policies. So this is something like really very interesting, to look at how it can play a relevant role into encouraging more climate ambition worldwide. And just very briefly to maybe clarify just really briefly about the free allocation. There is a free allocation under Article 10 for industry. There's an free allocation under Directives Article 10C for a power sector, which only can go to power sector producers in lower income member states, and it's not black and white. It's not good or wrong. It has advantages and disadvantages. Of course, it delays introduction of carbon pricing in these countries in power sector, but it also recognizes these regional differences and gives more time for transition if applied properly. So just to clarify that this is what I meant.
I think
my mistake, because I didn't realize you were talking about the modernization fund. I thought you were talking about auctioning revenues. The revenues that go to the national budget.
I thought the same as well.
So, yeah, I totally agree with your observation on modernization fund and why it is there, etc. I thought you were mentioning the auctioning revenues that go into the national budgets and that then are reinvested are used by member states according to different.
They should be used.
Yes,
they should be used.
They should be used for climate purposes, but many member states have used them in the past, not in that direction.
Barbara, when you hear Benjamin say a few times about the 8 million workers in energy-intensive industries, is that currently setting the pace of the transition? And how does that?
Sorry.
About having 8 million workers, people with jobs in heavy industries. Yeah, okay. Is that what dictates the pace right now of the transition? And how would you, because you had a plea for a more radical change if we want to meet our climate goals, how do you then look at that argument?
I think that,
how do you weigh that?
Probably I would like, maybe Benjamin can answer more in a more kind of structured way, because he knows that pretty well from the industry perspective. But from the civil society perspective, also taking into account my experience with industry. I think that we should kind of resist this narrative that innovation and going towards improving our environmental standards across all the economy means necessarily creating unemployed people. And because what we're talking about is a transition. And in a transition, we do not foresee that you leave people out, on the street or whatever. We think that governments, as much as industry, should be responsible for ensuring that this transition is fair and can be done together. Okay, so what I would like not to see is many companies, big or small, to kind of threaten governments that if they become more environmentally sustainable, they will have to put the people on the street. This is really a bad kind of approach, and it's totally, it's not also well reasoned, because we need to create good quality jobs, jobs towards becoming more sustainable, and there are many opportunities across the board. I mean, it doesn't mean that you will always have to build cars forever, or always have to build the same sort of cars forever, or we need to push in that direction, and governments are there to help, and EU funds are there to help. So I think I really would like to counteract this very dangerous narrative.
You also specifically use the word narrative.
Because this creates a lot of public resistance when people do not understand exactly how things are, and so it's a rhetoric that we need to kind of get away from. Otherwise, it will only increase public resistance.
That's interesting.
Can I jump in on this?
Yeah, of course you can. I also want to hear Ben on this. Do we need to?
Oh, sorry, Ben. Please go first if you want.
Sure, I can be quick.
Do you recognize that there's this narrative that doesn't? Well, you're saying it's not helpful because it's not. Yeah, it assumes that people will be left out on the streets if we continue more ambitious climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the first question you said, is it the 8 million workers that dictate the pace of the transition? I think it's voters. You know, it's what people vote for at the polls. And a bit to defend the Commission, who are often criticised for not being ambitious enough, or particularly for not being ambitious enough. I mean, they can only really reflect what people vote for. It has to pass through the European Parliament and the European Council. And if you have politicians sitting here who aren't as ambitious on climate as they could be, then it's quite difficult to push for more ambitious policies and transition. So I think it's the voters at the end of the day who dictate this pace, and you can see already a bit of a shift, I think, in recent years positively. On the narrative of lost jobs, I mean, I think it's an important, certainly it's an important thing to focus on and discuss. In the next 20 or 30 years, likely the net effect on jobs is going to be positive. I mean, we have to build a lot of stuff. We've got to build really,
is that
really.
A certainty?
I think modelling studies would generally find this. The issue is that they're different jobs requiring different skills. They're in different places, different countries, and that's of course difficult. It's not fair to expect workers simply just to to move where they live, where their house is, to somewhere else and work a new job with new skills. So it's certainly a huge challenge. But the narrative that responding to climate change is going to be the thing which kills all our jobs, at least in the medium term, I think, to me, doesn't have merit.
Benjamin.
Just to clarify, I mean, I fully agree with what the two previous speakers just said. I mean, defending employment doesn't mean that you defend the status quo. If you look at our members, I just had this morning a meeting gathering colleagues from the trade unions in Nordic countries and in Poland, and it was a really fascinating discussion. We had, on the one hand, a series of colleagues from Nordic countries telling us, yes, there are a few challenges here and there, but across the board, in our economy, we see more possibilities and opportunities in terms of investment, in terms of gaining competitive advantages for our key companies than challenges. I remember a colleague from Denmark told us we have fossil industry which is in decline in Denmark, but we took the opportunity of the development of the offshore wind industry to retrain, upskill, reskill our workers. And so you had all workers who became, thanks to a retraining, I don't know, welders for installing offshore wind. So this is a perfect example that this transition is manageable if you have the adequate framework, if you have the adequate resources and an industrial policy which makes the investment, the investment taking place in your region or in your country. And there is also an understanding among workers, including industrial workers, that the future of these sectors is, I would say, in low carbon and green markets. I attended a meeting in November in Central and Eastern Europe. It was a gathering of the trade unions coming from the automotive industry in Central Europe. And to be honest, I went there with the assumption that they would have a rather, defensive attitude regarding the transition. And let's be honest, there are huge challenges in the automotive supply chain. But I was struck by what a guy, I think from Czech Republic, told us. He told us, I don't want my plant to continue to produce diesel Passats for the coming 2 decades. I want my plant to attract investment in new low electric vehicles. They realize that this is where the future is, and they want to attract investment in those key technologies. We are not stupid, but at the same time, we have also to acknowledge that there are a series of sectors, parts of the value chains, countries, regions, where the challenges are much bigger than elsewhere. This is true for coal-based regions. This is true for instance, the part of the automotive supply chains, which are related to the manufacturing of equipments that only exist in internal combustion engine technologies. If you quickly move to purely electric vehicles, that part of the automotive industry is at risk, and those people, men and women, are at risk of losing their job. This is also a reality we have to pay attention to. I think that overlooking, neglecting that reality might lead us collectively as a society to really, really strong resistance against all what we are discussing today, climate policies and decarbonization. So yes, creating the right policy framework to attract investments in the transformation of the existing value chains, creating new industrial activities, and so on and so forth. This is something we have to do. We don't want to defend the status quo, but we also have to be sure that no one is left behind, and we have to be conscious of the fact that there will be sectors and regions where the challenges will be bigger, and ETS doesn't provide an answer to that. Maybe just 2 sentences on CBAM, because I didn't have the opportunity.
Have to close it down. I'm sorry, Benjamin.
Cautious implementation of CBAM, and do not throw away the existing framework to deal with carbon leakage, because as I said, we are entering into uncharted areas when it comes to carbon leakage. This is just what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Maybe you can stay in the chat for a little bit longer and also finish answer some questions in the chat. You got many questions, so that's nice to see that there was so many interaction. We need to wrap it up already. That went faster actually than the first panel. I don't know why, it went a lot faster. Maybe we brought Benjamin and Barbara a little bit closer together in their stands, I don't know. Leaving nobody behind is what I heard from Benjamin. At the same time, Barbara, I also really strongly heard your plea to not waste again another decade, because climate change is around the corner. I want to thank all of the panelists, also Julia, who joined us online. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise and bringing new insights into the discussion. Benjamin, of course, who is now chatting with everybody. Barbara, thank you very much for your activism and your expertise, and of course also Ben, thank you for sharing your research insights and your expertise with us. And of course I want to thank everybody who watched today, the first panel, the presentation that we started out with earlier today, and then the final panel. This was a launch event of the Carbon Pricing Hub, so we won't leave it at that. This will be the start of another dialogue with you as a citizen to also share your expertise and become part of the conversation about a new ETS system, which hopefully brings us to avoiding catastrophic climate change. Thank you very much for participating. I hope to see you next time. Big thanks to all of the speakers today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and let's see each other next time. Bye.